An Undeceptions podcast.
When Kathy Thomas and Kara Seamers brought their family out to look at the Christmas display on Voorhees Lane in Sycamore Township, it wasn't a complete success. That's because the nativity display might seem more appropriate for Halloween than Christmas. There's Joseph and Mary and even the baby Jesus as zombies.
Some people don't like it, but I like it.
How come?
Why? It's different.
Jason Dixon's nativity has been getting global publicity after the township threatened to fine him.
Zombies and baby Jesus kind of made a lot of people mad.
But the township says the undead...
That's a 2015 news clip from WCPO 9, bringing you the latest trusted news and information for the greater Cincinnati tri-state area, as they say. Zombie Jesus made people mad. And I must admit, it is very creepy. But that was Christmas. What about Easter? Easter is all about the dead coming back to life. It is just begging for a zombie reference. We don't have a news story from the trusted WCPO 9 Cincinnati, but a quick search of the internet finds all sorts of Easter zombie references. Zombie Jesus. He died for our sins. He's back for our brains. I'm so sorry to read that. I think we blame producer Kaylee for that one. Is that correct, or did researcher Al get
that's
that?
on me. That's on me.
Sounds more like Al. That was you.
I'm super proud of it.
I just can't believe you went there. But that is an actual meme producer Kaylee found, and it'll be doing the rounds this Easter. Kaylee has put it in the show notes, and fair warning, it's gross. But there's a real criticism here. The central event of the Christian faith is as ridiculous as zombies. To believe it, you have to have had your brains removed. That's the vibe. One way around the problem is to say the resurrection of Jesus was always intended as a metaphor. No one actually walked out of the grave. That would be silly. The whole thing is mythopoetic. It speaks of the resurrection in our hearts when we encounter the teaching and spirit of Jesus. That was a very 19th century Enlightenment approach. Few today think that's what the ancient texts ever meant to say, though you do get the occasional Anglican bishop who goes down that path, someone like John Shelby Spong, a long-time Episcopal bishop in the US and a best-selling author. But most people who study this question conclude that the first Christians really did think someone walked out of the grave. They may have been deluded, but that's what they reckoned. One statement from the Apostle Paul in the mid-50s AD puts it starkly. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. This is high stakes. If the resurrection isn't true, Christianity is arguably the greatest hoax in human history. Easter highlights the risky, even vulnerable position of the world's 2 billion-ish Christians. The overtly historical claims of Christianity put believers in a precarious position. Reports of the public execution of a famous teacher and healer, followed by an alleged resurrection, are just asking for a raised eyebrow. The logic is simple. If you say that something spectacular took place on the stage of human history, somewhere in the Middle East, not in Middle Earth, thoughtful people are going to ask you historical questions. It's as if Christianity places its neck on the chopping block of public scrutiny and invites anyone who wants to come and take a swing. And after centuries of swinging at the Christian faith, there it still stands, insisting that there is a bedrock of historical evidence that something unparalleled did happen that first Easter day. Personally, I don't think that history can demonstrate the resurrection happened. It's only history, after all. It's limited in what it can and can't demonstrate. But historical research from believers and skeptics, and everything in between, has led to a very wide consensus among the specialists that something remarkable happened shortly after the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. The great Cambridge scholar C.F.D. Moll spoke for many when he wrote that early Christianity rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and shape of resurrection. And then he wryly asked the broader guild of historians, what does the secular scholar propose to stop that hole with? In other words, something strange and unprecedented certainly happened, and it's quite a puzzle working out what exactly it was. I'm John Dixon, and this is Undeceptions. This season of Undeceptions is sponsored by Zondervan Academic. Get discounts on master lectures, video courses, and exclusive samples of their books at zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions. Each episode, we explore some aspect of life, faith, history, philosophy, science, culture, or ethics that's either much misunderstood or mostly forgotten. With the help of people who know what they're talking about, we're trying to undeceive ourselves and let the truth out.
One of the things that's often denied by defenders of historicity is that there were dying and rising gods before Jesus. I found that attack is not defensible. The first of these, Osiris, he was, originated in Egypt. I mean, he's an Egyptian god, although Osiris cult spread all over the Mediterranean. It was known everywhere. And in his cult, people who were baptized into his death and resurrection were saved in the afterlife. So we have this model already pre-existing Christianity. So when you see the Christians now teaching it, it looks like what happened is that the Jews saw a similar cult idea like this, decided to create a Jewish version of it, and marketed it that way. It's impossible to suggest that it's just a complete coincidence.
That's part of a talk given by the atheist activist Richard Carrier back in 2018. Carrier does have a PhD in ancient history, specifically ancient critiques of Christianity. But he's chosen not to work in a university, but instead to establish a kind of apologetics ministry, if that's not a weird thing to say in this context, on behalf of atheism. He's really very popular in online skeptic circles. His point is that Christianity wasn't the first to claim a dying and rising saviour. And Carrier's view is not new either. It started way back in 1890 with a book by James Fraser titled The Golden Bough, which was an attempt to find connections between all sorts of ancient myths across the world. One of the great myths, he thought, was the Corn King. Life, death, and rebirth were mythical representations of the cycles of planting and then harvesting in the spring. And C.S. Lewis actually acknowledged that he accepted Fraser's account of Christianity as just another myth before he became a Christian. It's been a popular idea. So I asked my esteemed guest today what he reckoned. What weight should we give, just thinking historically, to the alleged other stories of dying and rising gods as the immediate background for this story of a dying, rising God?
I think that, and of course, appealing to those kinds of pagan stories has become very popular among those people who think that Jesus didn't even exist. And there are, of course, a lot of other good arguments to be had on that front.
That, my friends, is Richard Bauckham, one of the most highly rated biblical scholars and historians in the world today. I met him at his home in Cambridge on a whirlwind trip a few weeks ago. I'd been in Oxford that morning interviewing N.T. Wright for our next episode, actually, and then scooted over to Cambridge to meet Professor Bauckham in the afternoon. What a day. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for giving me your time.
All right. So you've just come from Oxford?
I have, yes. I got in last night from Chicago.
Oh, right.
Professor Borkham is one of the rare breeds of trained historian and biblical scholar. He was for many years the Professor of New Testament at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. He retired early to concentrate on research and writing, and he moved to Cambridge, where he's the senior scholar at Ridley Hall, Cambridge. Perhaps Professor Borkham's most influential volume is Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, where he argued pretty persuasively that behind the New Testament Gospels lies genuine eyewitness testimony. We'll get to that in a little bit.
Probably the best argument against seeing dying and rising gods as the background to those stories is simply that the milieu of the stories is thoroughly Jewish. I think there's no doubt about that. And when the early Christians talked about the resurrection of Jesus, they meant the kind of resurrection that Jews were expecting in any case at the end of history, a resurrection of the human person, bodily and spiritual, by God. And that's what they identified as having happened in Jesus' case. So the very concept of resurrection that they used to interpret what they witnessed came from Judaism and not from pagan religions.
There were different strands of Judaism in the first century, as we explored in our Jewish Jesus episode last season. There were Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and more. They all had slightly different ideas about the end times.
Well, I think probably most Jews did believe in resurrection. I think the Sadducees are singled out because they were an exception to the general view. And of course, the Sadducees were a very small minority of wealthy priestly families in Jerusalem. They were not really terribly important in terms of general Jewish belief. Whereas what the Pharisees believed, other people took notice of and followed. They didn't follow what the Sadducees thought. So certainly the Pharisees believed in resurrection, and they were probably very influential among Jews in general. And we have plenty of other literature testing that. So what did they believe? They believed that at the end of history, when God brings everything to its conclusion, the day of judgment happens, all the rights and wrongs of history are sorted out, and the righteous are taken into an eternal life of bliss, paradisal life with God, and the wicked are condemned in some way. So they expected the general resurrection of all humans at the end of history. And they expected it, I think, well, partly because it was already there in the Jewish scriptures. The book of Daniel in particular has a very clear indication of resurrection.
And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to the everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Book of Daniel, chapter 12.
And also because I think it kind of made sense within the Jewish framework of belief. It meant that the Jewish framework of belief, right back from the scriptures through the scriptures, through the intertestamental period, the whole sort of framework of Jewish belief was highly moral. In other words, God was expected to ensure that justice was done in the world, that the good, as it were, get the reward of their goodness, and the wicked pay for ignoring God's requirements. This doesn't happen in the present life as we observe it. Particularly, it didn't seem to be happening in the period when the Pharisees became important, when there were lots of Jewish martyrs, for example. And so I think the belief in resurrection, that all these apparent injustices of history would be sorted out in the end, made a lot of sense to Jews of that period.
So it's God has to make all things well.
Yes, exactly.
But why resurrection? Why not just going into a netherworld where he sorts it all out?
Well, exactly. That's a good point. And I think, again, this is distinctively Jewish, a belief in the unitary nature of the human person, that we are not purely spiritual beings who happen to be in a body, which was a common Greek view, but that the full humanity as God created us consists in a spiritual element, a soul, a mind. The spiritual and the bodily are interconnected and essential to each other. Now, many Jews did believe that the soul of the dead survived death, and was held, as it were, in waiting for the resurrection. But it wasn't regarded as a kind of satisfactory afterlife. It was merely a provisional waiting period, because true human life is embodied life. So in detail, they might have differences about exactly what would the resurrection body be like. Would it be just like this, or would it be improved, and so forth? But in general, I think the conviction that true human life is embodied life accounts for the belief in resurrection. And it's quite clear, of course, that that is what the early Christians thought about Jesus. Not that he'd simply survived death, but that he was raised bodily.
So just as some might say, wrongly, as you point out, that the Osiris death and resurrection myth could have influenced the resurrection story, okay, we can park that, but is it not possible that all we have in the Gospels and Paul's letters is a storytelling based on that Jewish belief that resurrection has to happen? So rather than it being a pagan background, it is a Jewish background, but it creates the story itself.
Yes, I think the main answer to that is simply that Jesus' resurrection happened all on its own, as it were. It wasn't part of the general resurrection which Jews were expecting at the end of history. And I think this is why probably Pharisees, for example, were not easily inclined to believe in Jesus' resurrection, because they weren't expecting a single resurrection of one man ahead of everybody else. So the sort of singularity of Jesus' resurrection was completely unexpected, I would say, in Judaism. But the other thing that's worth noticing is that when Paul, of course, writes about resurrection, and he connects Jesus' resurrection with our future resurrection, and he writes quite theologically about it. But if you read the stories in the Gospels of the empty tomb, they actually don't have much theology in them. They read like straightforward stories of what happened, and they don't look as though they're influenced by...
So if it was a theological creation put in historical narrative, you'd expect the theology to be at the surface.
Yes, you would. Yes.
Okay,
And they don't look like that. They look like reports.
Yeah.
It's a widespread view among scholars today, secular, Jewish or Christian scholars, that the Gospels would have been read in their own time as biographies. We have more than 50 other examples of biographies in the ancient world, biographies of emperors, generals, and so on. It's an entirely different literary category from ancient fiction.
I think the Gospels would have been perceived at the time, and that this is kind of quite important, I think. How would people have read these at the time? Would they have thought they were a piece of historical fiction, because there was historical fiction in the ancient world? Would they have taken them seriously as history? And I think they would have seen them as somewhat like the historical biographies that people were familiar with, which were always written within memory, within the lifetime of someone who knew the subject of the biography. So they would expect the Gospels, if they heard anything about the origins of the Gospels, they would expect them to derive from people who had known Jesus and witnessed the events. And the other point about what people looked for in good history is important. They did expect good history to be contemporary. It had to be within the lifetime of the events, because ancient historians didn't have all the documentary sources that other historians have. They depended to a very large extent on eyewitness memory. So eyewitness memory, but the other thing that was thought to be very good about history, that would mark out good history, was accuracy about geography and chronology. And I think on those grounds, John's Gospel in particular scores very highly. We always know where Jesus is in John's Gospel. We always know within a few months of what period of his ministry we are in. John obviously takes pains to lay out this careful chronological sequence and to give some precise detail very often about locations. I think most people agree that John's Gospel does show considerable knowledge of pre-70 Jerusalem. And it is important to realise, of course, that Jerusalem was only like that up to the Jewish War in 66. After 70, a great deal of Jerusalem has vanished, destroyed, rubble. And moreover, not many people went there even to see what was there. And I think people would have supposed that constitutes quite good history.
There's been a lot of stuff written about the resurrection. Biblical scholar and historian Mike Licona, g'day Mike, great guy, great writer, great historian, estimates that over 3,400 academic books and articles have been written on this topic over just the last 35 years. One of the most important volumes comes from Dale Allison from Princeton Theological Seminary. His 2021 book, The Resurrection of Jesus, states up front that people who write books on the resurrection often set themselves one of two tasks. Here's what he says. Either they seek to establish with some assurance, or even beyond a reasonable doubt, that God raised Jesus from the dead, or they seek to establish with some assurance, or beyond a reasonable doubt, that God did no such thing. Attempting to establish that the resurrection itself is beyond reasonable doubt is part of what we might call Christian apologetics. Long-time listeners know that I'm not a huge fan of apologetics, of the word or the industry. I mean, the root word does appear in the New Testament. The Apostle Peter, in his letter to the Christians of Asia Minor, wrote, "Always be prepared to give an apologia, a defense, to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." But there's no way Peter was imagining a whole industry of books and courses designed to amass arguments to prove every part of the Christian faith. And there's no way he would approve of the exaggerations that often appear in Christian apologetics. I prefer to bring good historical, good scientific, good philosophical arguments to bear on Christianity, at least to give people good reason to consider the Christian faith for themselves. It's one of the key aims of the whole undeceptions thing, to clear away the bad arguments for and against Christianity, so that listeners can work out if there are any solid reasons to take a second look at Jesus. Sorry, that's our standard rant. It's also our raison d'etre here at Undeceptions. I asked Professor Borkham what he thinks of the distinction between apologetics and genuine history.
I guess that the temptation for people doing apologetics is to actually put the strongest conceivable case they can find. Whereas I think the historian's responsibility is to weigh up the evidence and have a reasonable degree of skepticism and a reasonable degree of acceptance of the evidence, but to try not to have an agenda, I suppose, is the point. I mean, it's difficult for even a historian not to have an agenda. We all have preferences and the ways our minds think and all that sort of thing. But I think the historian's job is to lay out the evidence and draw some conclusions. Whereas the apologist, I think perhaps a good apologist does do that, but the temptation for an apologist is to ignore the negative criticisms that might be made of the case.
I see another distinction, and it's one that you've written about, between good general history as an approach to New Testament studies and New Testament studies. In fact, I'm going to quote you back at you, if you don't mind. It's from an essay 10 years ago. Gospels scholars need to learn historical method, not within the claustrophobic confines of the dominant tradition of gospel scholarship, but amid the broad horizons of ordinary historical scholarship. What do you mean, and what difference does that make?
I do think that within biblical studies generally, because it's such a specialised field, people do tend to simply learn from other biblical scholars how to do history as they think it. And there is a great danger, that the subject can develop its own sort of way of doing history, which would not be recognised by historians in other fields. So I've always thought it has been an advantage for me to have had a very good training, first degree and PhD in history, before I got into academic biblical studies. I think the particular temptation is to be over-sceptical of the evidence. And I think this partly comes out of the whole issue of the historical Jesus, because there was a stage where New Testament scholars were saying, well, we really don't know anything much about the historical Jesus. And people who took that up and tried to build a solid historical basis for the historical Jesus, were terribly concerned to be as skeptical as possible so that the evidence they came up with, the conclusions they came up with, were as stringent as possible. But I think that just went too far. And it may be a good idea, as it were, to start with the things that are most generally agreed about Jesus, the ones for which we have most evidence, but not to stop there, but for that to be a basis from which to draw a broader picture of Jesus.
In the examination of the resurrection, almost all scholars agree on a few basic facts about the fate of Jesus. We'll go beyond the cross and into the grave and out again after the break. This episode of Undeceptions is brought to you by Zondervan Academic's new book, Jesus and the Powers, by N.T. Wright and Undeceptions' favourite, Mike Bird. Should Christianity have anything to do with politics? I mean, you could argue that Christians have done more harm than good once they get a whiff of power. Mike Bird and N.T. Wright address this question and other questions in this magnificent overview of the political implications of the Christian faith and the Church's historical engagement with the powers and principalities. They shed light on current geopolitical events and ask, what would it look like if there were a faithful Christian response to crises like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the China-Taiwan tension, political turmoil in the US, UK and Australia, and the problem of Christian nationalism. They build a pretty convincing case that Jesus' teaching about the kingdom of God confronts all forms of power, Christian and atheist, and calls on us all to support a pluralistic democracy where everyone, regardless of religion or irreligion, has a role to play in working toward the good of society. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, I'd say this book will be an eye-opener. You can order Jesus and the Powers on Amazon, of course, or head to zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions to dig a little deeper and see if you really like it. That's zondervanacademic.com/undeceptions.
Elvis Presley, dead at 42 and mourned by millions around the world, was laid to rest today in a colorful ceremony in Memphis.
It was August 16th, 1977, and the world was shocked by the news. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was dead. His wake and funeral drew tens of thousands of fans to his Graceland mansion. Millions worldwide mourned his passing, and yet to this day, there are some who believe the king lives.
Those people who say Elvis lives are not referring to his music lasting forever or his spirit being with them. Some of these people really believe that the king is alive.
He called and he said, I'm doing fine, and I know you've been wondering what I've been doing, and everything's okay, and thank you for caring. That was basically it. I was sort of in shock, so I didn't...
That's a clip from an Inside Edition report titled The Strangest Theories We've Seen People Believe In. Elvis is alive, and we know this because some women told us they'd heard from him after he died. Sounds kind of familiar, right? The claim that Elvis is still alive is rightly categorized as a conspiracy theory. Plenty of people would tell you that the resurrection of Jesus is just another conspiracy theory. But here's the thing. There are sophisticated academic reasons for taking the resurrection narrative seriously as history. As Dale Allison, whom I mentioned earlier, writes, the resurrection is the prize puzzle of New Testament research. Few experts today dismiss the resurrection out of hand, like we all do with the claim that Elvis is alive, except for director Mark.
Yeah, that's me right there.
Why is the resurrection taken seriously? Part of the reason is the extremely early date of the eyewitness claims about the resurrection. We know the basic story can't have been a developing legend. It was an instant something. We know this because of a passing paragraph in a letter of the Apostle Paul to the city of Corinth. I was in Corinth just last week, by the way. Here's what Paul wrote to the Corinthians. Hoti Christos epethenen huper ton hamartion hemon katatas graphas. Kai hoti etaphe.
For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12.
Can we talk about the significance of Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians, which a lot of scholars say is some kind of pre-Pauline creedal statement, that Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised, and he appeared. Yeah. Can you explain to listeners what is the big deal about those 4 lines, historically speaking?
I think the importance of recognising it as sort of something that Paul took over rather than invented for himself is simply that it takes us further back into history. And he's most likely to have got it from the Jerusalem church, because after his own encounter with Christ, he himself visited Jerusalem and met some of the leaders of the Jerusalem church. So it takes us back even earlier than Paul's letter. I think that's important.
Well, to the mid-30s then, if it's a reference to that 2 weeks he spent. Yeah.
Indeed, yes. And people forget that Paul's conversion, if we can call it that, his becoming a follower of Christ, happened actually not so long after the resurrection. So he himself is a very early witness, really, to what was happening at that time. My view of that sort of creedal statement, one can almost call it a creed, it's a formulaic statement of belief, is that Paul has probably excerpted it from a longer sort of creed, which probably started with Jesus' baptism and said something about his ministry. Yeah. Because if you look at the sermons that the apostles preach in the book of Acts, many of them take the form of a little summary of the story of Jesus. And they habitually start with the baptism of John, with John's ministry of baptism, as indeed Mark's gospel does as well. And they say something about Jesus went about doing good and performing miracles. And then he was crucified, and then he rose again, and then he was seen by witnesses. So I think Paul has probably exerted from a longer, but always a summary, the bit that was relevant to his argument in that letter, which was about the reality of resurrection. I think that sort of summary must have been widely used by early Christian preachers, because what are you going to do if you're just telling people who know nothing about Jesus, introducing your Christian message? You would want to tell the story of Jesus. Who is Jesus?
I think maybe Richard is assuming we all know the background to these things. So let me be clear about the dramatic historical significance of this little paragraph. Paul's letters were written in the middle of the 1st century, about 20 to 30 years after Jesus. By ancient standards, that's still a relatively small time gap between event and record. I think I've said before on the podcast that Tacitus, the greatest of ancient Rome's chroniclers, wrote his account of Caesar Tiberius 80 years after the emperor had died. So 20 years between event and writing is about as good as it gets. But here's the thing. Those 4 lines in Paul's letter to the Corinthians are not fresh thoughts of Paul in the letter in the 50s AD. They are a clear mnemonic, a memory device, which Paul says he'd already passed on to them in person several years earlier, and which he acknowledges he himself had received when he became a disciple. This was common practice in both Jewish schools and philosophical schools. The Epicureans, for example, also had a 4-line mnemonic that summarized their great teachers, Epicurus's, teachings. It was called the Fourfold Medicine, and it goes like this. Aphobon hotheos, anupopton hotanotos,
unafraid of deity, unconcerned by death, the good well acquired, and trouble well withstood.
The point of these creeds, as you might call them, was to summarise in memorable form a much larger body of material. We know that this 4-line Epicurean jingle deliberately summarised over 2,000 words of Epicurean philosophy. We also have the 2,000-word version. My point is, the 4-line statement Paul quotes is the earliest summary of the events of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and appearances to Peter and the 12. And we can roughly date it because Paul became a follower of Christ around 31-32, and then he made a visit to the eyewitnesses in Jerusalem around 33-34. So he must have received this little creed, this mnemonic summary of the faith, somewhere in that time period. Let's be safe and say the middle of the 30s AD. That is as close to the events as a historian could hope for. It establishes beyond reasonable doubt that at least 6 elements of the narrative of Jesus arose immediately after his death, and they can't be part of a developing legend. The 6 are Jesus' status as Christ or Messiah, his death for sins, his burial in a tomb, his resurrection after 3 days, and his multiple appearances, and finally, his appointment of 12 apostles. All of this was sufficiently well known by AD 35 to have become part of a formal mnemonic summary of Christianity, which was passed on to converts from Jerusalem to Greece. Okay, back to Richard Bauckham.
But can we talk about the burial? So the creedal statement says, kai hoti etaphe, that he was buried. And some say he wouldn't have been buried. He would have just, like every other crucifixion victim, tossed into a shallow grave, eaten by dogs or whatever. You probably see it differently.
Yes. We actually have a rather exciting new piece of evidence about this. Just very recently, a few years ago, the body of a crucified man was discovered in Cambridgeshire, just about 15, 20 miles from here. And it's only the second crucified person who has been discovered, the other in Jerusalem, but no one has...
We actually spoke to the archaeologist in charge of this find. If you want to hear the details, check out The Crucifixion, episode 93.
So it was quite momentous, actually, because we know that crucifixions occurred in their thousands all over the Roman Empire, but no one has previously identified any such person from their remains, as it were. And there may be various reasons for that. It may be that the 2 that we have both have a nail stuck in their heel, but only one nail. And the normal practice after a crucifixion, I think, would have been to remove the nails because they could be used again. So it's quite possible that lots of crucified people have not been recognised by the archaeologists because there are no nails, and you'd have to look pretty closely at the ankles to realise. Anyhow, we now have a second crucified man, and he, like the one in Jerusalem, was buried, quite properly buried, in a grave with other people, in a graveyard, presumably by his family. The crucified man who was found, his bones were found in an ossuary, a bone box in a tomb in Jerusalem, was probably also a member of that family, whom the family wished to give proper burial to after the crucifixion. So I think that makes it perfectly credible that in Jesus' case, someone who had one of those rock-cut tombs that only quite wealthy people in Jerusalem had, someone who had one of those tombs, Joseph of Arimathea, asked to have the body buried in this new tomb. And of course, we know a lot about those tombs. There are lots of them around Jerusalem. They've been investigated. We know the burial practices, what they did. And so Jesus would have been laid on a shelf just inside the tomb, preparatory to a year later, his bones being gathered and put in an ossuary to preserve them. We know that those tombs had entrances blocked with rocks, mainly in order to keep the animals out, because animals would come and try and eat the flesh and so on. You really didn't want animals getting in there. So practice of having a boulder to block the entrance was commonplace. So everything that actually the Gospels say in detail about Jesus' burial fits perfectly well what we know about that sort of Jewish burial.
So a burial, yes, and the fact that it's mentioned in that creedal statement means it's a very early claim. But the creed doesn't say there was an empty tomb. And some are very skeptical about the stories of the empty tomb, discovery of the empty tomb, that they're late accumulations. What do you feel is historical in the discovery of the empty tomb?
I think, by the way, that probably opinion is moving away from the idea that they're late legends towards an earlier origin for the stories. So that's not so unusual now to think that at least they come from a fairly early period of the early church. And of course, we're only ever talking in a couple of decades anyway, but fairly early in that period. I think, well, first of all, it's not what anyone would have expected. And of course, the stories tell us, people must have taken Jesus. They can't believe it. Basically, when the women go to the tomb and they go back to the male disciples and that they think, oh, it's just a story. Women are gullible. They don't really know what's happening. So there's no disposition to believe this on the part of the early Christians who found the tomb to be empty. And I think it's reasonable to say that we have multiple testimony to this, because the different Gospels have different stories and they refer to different characters. Salome, for example, one of the women, is only mentioned in Mark's account. Joanna, another of the women, is only mentioned in Luke's account. Mary Magdalene is there in every case. And of course, when you get beyond the empty tomb to the appearance stories, and it's the appearances, you see, that seem to have convinced the apostles in general that the women were telling the truth. But John, of course, has this story of Peter and the beloved disciple going themselves to investigate the tomb and finding it empty. So there are multiple kind of indications of what happened that are not easily explained, I think, by a simple legend.
Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him." Peter and the other disciples started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said, Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. John chapter 20.
People often raise the fact that it was women who were the first witnesses of the empty tomb strengthens slightly the claim, because women weren't taken that seriously, so you wouldn't invent women as the best witnesses. Is that more than mere apologetics? Do you think there's something sort of historically forceful there?
Yes, I think there is something. People sometimes say that women's testimony wasn't very much valued in court, and that is probably something in that. But I think much more significant, actually, is that women were regarded as gullible in matters of religion. One early critic of Christianity, a man called Celsus, we have pretty large extracts from his work, and he said, so who were the witnesses to this? One poor fisherman and one hysterical woman.
He wouldn't get well along in this world today.
No, but that was a common opinion, and I think it's significant that it was particularly in matters of religion that women were thought to be gullible. Quite know why that was, but it does seem to have been a fact.
One of the other Gospels, the Gospel of John, tells us that it was one of these women, Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene, who was the first to claim to actually see the risen Jesus with her own eyes. She's one of many individuals we know said they had seen Jesus after death.
Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw 2 white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they have taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they have put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go, find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, "I have seen the Lord." Then she gave them his message. John chapter 20.
There seems to be a wide consensus amongst those who have written on the topic of the resurrection that Jesus' first followers experienced sightings of Jesus. There might be various ways to say it. Thought they saw Jesus. Imagined they saw Jesus. But there seems to be a very wide consensus. Hardly anyone doubts those original people thought they had encountered Jesus. Can you just speak historically? Why is there such a solid consensus around that detail?
Yes. It's partly, of course, because we have one such witness who speaks for himself in the person of Paul, and Paul's evidence is rather unique. You know, he tells us what he himself has experienced and how it changed his life and how important it was. And he's also rather different. The way he describes it, it seems to be a bit different from some of the other stories we have. So, you know, it's kind of distinctive. He's not just following a pattern. And then, of course, Paul gives us a list of other people who'd seen the risen Jesus. Quite a long list, including at one point he says 500 brothers and sisters at the same time, which is quite extraordinary. And other groups, so the appearances appear to be to individuals, as in Paul's case, but he also talks about groups like the apostles, the 12, and the 500. So a range of different kinds of appearances, which make it more difficult to explain it all psychologically as some kind of, you know, hysterical phenomenon in which some people influence others and all kinds of things could happen. So I think the range of kinds of appearance that Paul testifies to, and Paul, I think, would have been a quite rigorous questioner of those who claimed to have seen the risen Jesus, because, you know, he was in the process of taking this on for himself. It was extraordinarily important to him. So I don't think he would have been gullible about these reports. Just to go back to the appearance to the 500 brothers and sisters, I think it's extremely interesting when Paul says, some of whom are still alive. Now, why does he say that? I mean, actually, most of the individuals he refers to, like Peter, were still alive also. But he says in the case of the 500 that some of them are still alive because he means ask them. If you doubt it, you know, check it out for yourself, ask them. They're around, and there are lots of them. You don't necessarily have to come to Jerusalem to find one. They're all around you. They're significant people in the Christian communities. So I think Paul actually at that point says, you know, this is evidence anyone can check for themselves. It's not some kind of esoteric knowledge. It's a witness that's open to people to tap into and make their own judgments about. And it's also notable, of course, that Paul's list of the resurrection appearances does not mention the women. So Paul may have been sensitive to this idea that that wasn't the best evidence. Peter and James and so on are better witnesses.
People often ask, why didn't Jesus appear to non-believers? Why just to his little group of disciples? But he did. It's just that those non-believers did the very logical thing and became believers afterwards. We just heard about Paul's conversion after seeing the risen Jesus. He turned from an outright persecutor of the Christians to the greatest Christian missionary of all time. And the other was Jesus' brother, James. The Gospels make clear that James disbelieved during Jesus' lifetime, right up to the crucifixion. In a brief aside, the Gospel of John laments, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him." That's John chapter 7, if you want to check that out. The Gospel of Mark reports with brutal honesty, when Jesus' family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." Mark chapter 3. But this James, the brother of Jesus, ends up becoming a believer after he has his own encounter with the risen Jesus. He goes on to become the leader of the Jerusalem church. And if that sounds dodgy, like, of course James would say Jesus rose from the dead, it came with benefits, we need to think again. These eyewitnesses didn't instantly inherit the Vatican or something like that. They didn't get any glory. They got ostracization, plummeting social status, persecution, and in James's case, execution. We have a first-century report from the Jewish writer Josephus that this same James died for his Christianity in the year 62.
The younger Ananus, who had been appointed to the high priesthood, was rash in his temper and unusually daring. Possessed of such a character, Ananus thought that he had a favourable opportunity because Festus, the Roman governor, was dead and Albinus, the new Roman governor, was still on the way. And so he convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them the one named James, the brother of Jesus who was called the Messiah, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the Jewish law and delivered them up to be stoned to death. Jewish Antiquities, Book 20.
So here's the other thing that even highly skeptical historians point out. The fact that numerous eyewitnesses lost their lives for their claims about Jesus at least tells us they were sincere in those claims. People die for all sorts of true and untrue claims, of course, but no one knowingly dies for what they know to be untrue. These early witnesses, these martyrs, must have really thought they saw Jesus. It is impossible to suppose there was any conscious deception in the resurrection reports. They're not my words, by the way. They're the words of the father of Jewish scholarship on Jesus, the great historian Joseph Klausner. Then there's Ed Sanders of Duke University, who sadly recently passed away, but not before leaving an indelible mark on the historical study of both ancient Judaism and Christianity. He wasn't one to defend Christianity. He himself argued that the Gospels made plenty of errors and exaggerated things. But on the question of the resurrection, he wrote in his famous book, The Historical Figure of Jesus, these words: "I do not regard deliberate fraud as a worthwhile explanation. Many of the people in these lists of witnesses were to spend the rest of their lives proclaiming that they had seen the risen Lord, and several of them would die for their cause." So how does Sanders account for this? Well, he does what many scholars do. He says, "I don't know." Here's how he put it. That Jesus' followers, and later Paul, had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. Someone who argued along similar lines was the great Oxford professor of Jewish studies, Gezer Vermesh. Certainly not a Christian, Professor Vermesh wrote the book The Resurrection of Jesus. His conclusion, over the 250 pages of the book, was pretty straightforward. It looks like there was probably an empty tomb, and it's virtually certain they thought they'd seen the risen Jesus. So I asked Richard about all of this.
Gezer Vermesh, in his many books on Jesus, mentioned the resurrection tantalizingly without telling us what he thought, and then he wrote a book called The Resurrection, in which he just, in 250 pages, told us probably an empty tomb, definitely the disciples thought they saw him, full stop. In some ways, it's very frustrating without telling us what it means. Was he just being a responsible historian? Must we stop there? Is that where the full stop must go?
I think it's actually quite interesting that, as you quote him, he said probably and definitely. I mean, he makes those distinctions because we'd always have to remember that historical conclusions are probabilistic. I mean, some historical conclusions are so very probable that it's madness to doubt them. But things vary on the scale of probability. And so one is always thinking, how probable is this? It's not usually a cut and dried this or that. There's usually degrees of probability involved. And I guess that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to weigh up the evidence. But probably is quite a strong statement, I think. I quite often say probably when I'm writing history.
Yes.
And maybe people...
Even Dale Allison in his recent book says probably an empty tomb.
Yes. And maybe people who aren't used to reading or writing history think probably evinces doubt, whereas actually it's quite a strong statement, probably. And in the nature of the case, one cannot be absolutely certain about a historical conclusion. That's how it is. But nor can one be absolutely certain about all kinds of things that we rely on in daily life all the time. Certainty is not the nature of most human knowledge. Most of our human knowledge is probabilistic. I don't really know what happened in the Rochdale by-election yesterday. I just know what the reporters have said on the radio. They could be lying, they could be misinformed. You never know for certain unless you're there yourself at the time.
Actually, the Rochdale by-election was a really big deal in the 24 hours I was in the UK recently. Just Google what happened in the Rochdale by-election. That's just for free today. After all this talk of the eyewitness testimony in the Gospels, I had to ask Professor Borkham about the ending of Mark's Gospel. The common consensus is that Mark was first to embark on the task of writing a biography of the life and teachings of Jesus. But Mark's Gospel, you may know, in its original form, doesn't include the resurrection. Grab a modern Bible and turn to the end of Mark's Gospel, and you'll see Mark chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, and an account of Jesus appearing to various disciples after his death, and he even gives a little speech. But that last section of Mark is certainly a late addition, and most Bibles today actually say this isn't found in the best manuscripts. Historians think that some scribe, maybe in the 2nd century, was uncomfortable with the way Mark ended, sort of inconclusively, with the women running away from the tomb afraid. And so this scribe very helpfully added what he knew had happened from the other Gospels and then just added it to his copy of Mark's Gospel. But let me be clear, it's not that the scribe was trying to deceive us by saying this is really what was in Mark's Gospel, because he doesn't even hide the fact that he's writing in a very different style from Mark. And it is so obviously a summary of what the other 3 Gospels say. So it's like an appendix. Anyway, that means that Mark's Gospel ends with 3 women going to the tomb of Jesus, finding it empty, seeing a messenger from God, and then running away afraid. Full stop.
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early, on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Why doesn't our first gospel, Mark, have resurrection appearances? I've heard of a well-known skeptical scholar say, it's not even there in the first gospel.
The honest answer to why Mark doesn't... The question is actually, why does Mark's gospel end where it does, which is after the discovery of the empty tomb, but before any resurrection appearances? I don't know why Mark ended there. I think it's still something of a puzzle. But I'm absolutely sure that Mark thought there were resurrection appearances because earlier in the gospel he has Jesus predict them. Jesus says, I will go and I will see you in Galilee. And Mark would not have recorded a prophecy of Jesus like that didn't happen. So I think there can be no doubt that whatever the reason why Mark doesn't record them, it's not that he doesn't think they happened. Why does he stop there? Of course, there are lots of theories about, he meant to go on or the ending has been lost, multiple explanations. I do tend to think that Mark must have deliberately stopped there because I find it very difficult to believe that otherwise someone would not have repaired the damage and given us a complete copy rather than this mutilated copy. So I think Mark meant to stop there. It may be that Mark was hesitant to record kind of experience which was utterly unique and which perhaps he didn't think he could make convincing by writing a story about it. That's just a guess, but maybe that's the reason.
I actually disagree with Richard on this one. I'm not 100% sure that's allowed, but hear me out. For what it's worth, I find myself persuaded by Bruce Metzger. He was the chairman of the editorial committee for the Greek New Testament. These are the people who produced the published Greek text that scholars and translators use for our modern New Testaments. Anyway, Metzger also published a commentary about all of the committee's decisions when they were putting together the Greek text. And in a random footnote about the ending of Mark, he writes this: 3 possibilities are open. A, the evangelist, Mark, intended to close his gospel at this place. Or B, the gospel was never finished. Or, as seems most probable, C, the gospel accidentally lost its last leaf before it was multiplied by transcription. That seems more plausible to me than that Mark ended simply with the women running away from the tomb, saying nothing to anyone. But of course, I'm not Professor Richard Bauckham, and you should always take what Bauckham says more seriously than what I say. The excellent point that Richard makes is that whatever the truth of the ending of Mark's gospel, Mark himself absolutely knew about the appearances after the discovery of the empty tomb. There are 2 earlier references in Mark to Jesus later appearing to his disciples in Galilee. So in Mark 14, verse 27, the not yet crucified Jesus says, "After I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." And in Mark 16:7, still part of the original Mark's gospel, the strange messenger at the empty tomb tells the women, "Go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." This puts it beyond doubt that Mark knew not only of the resurrection, but of stories of the risen Jesus appearing to the disciples in Galilee. So, contrary to some popular skeptical claims, the Gospel of Mark, our earliest biography of Jesus, does report both the resurrection and the appearances.
The other interesting thing about that book Vermesh wrote is that he then has a little appendix that lists, I think, the 5 potential naturalistic explanations, and basically says they're all rubbish.
Yes.
What do you think is the best naturalistic explanation?
Well, I think the idea that Jesus in some way survived is thoroughly improbable, because this is not the impression of the risen Jesus, and a Jesus who just about survived crucifixion. And it'd be very difficult to survive crucifixion, but if he just about survived crucifixion, his state would not be such that people could think he had risen to new life. So I think that's extremely improbable. And eventually, of course, he would have died in that case, and the whole and Christianity would probably have fizzled out if that had happened. So it's extremely improbable. Someone stole the body, or the women went to the wrong tomb. I suppose those are the other contenders. The women went to the wrong tomb. Now, it's very interesting that Mark clearly sets out his evidence in such a way as to contradict that possibility, because Mark refers to 3 of the women disciples who were with Jesus when he died on the cross, the 2 Marys and Salome. And he wants to say, there were people who saw him die. He really died. And then he tells us that Jesus was buried in Joseph's tomb. And 2 of those women, the 2 Marys, saw where he was buried, Mark's words. And then at the empty tomb, it's the 3 of them again, the 2 women and Salome. So I think in the first place, Mark is being very careful about citing the witnesses who actually did witness each stage. So Salome didn't witness the burial, but there she was at the empty tomb. He's also very clear that they knew which tomb it was and went to it. So I think Mark is deliberately setting out the evidence like that. You could say he's lying, but I think is a reasonable reason for saying that was not thought to be a probable explanation. Someone stole the body. I suppose the real difficulty with that would be, why did they do it? And the story that Matthew's Gospel reports as something that Jewish opponents of Christianity were saying, that the disciples stole the body, of course runs into the fact that the disciples were obviously deeply convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. I mean, the origin and growth of the early church is inexplicable unless they really did believe that Jesus had risen from the dead. They wouldn't have believed that if they'd stolen the body. So it doesn't seem to be that there's an easily available explanation.
We'll be back in a moment.
Perhaps the critics are right and the drama is played out now and Jesus is safely dead and buried. Perhaps. It is ironical and entertaining to consider that at least once in the world's history, those words might have been said with complete conviction. And that was on the eve of the resurrection.
That's a quote from the wonderful Dorothy L. Sayers, one of the patron saints of undeceptions, I'd say. I love the perhaps at the start of that quote. It expresses the hesitation many have towards the resurrection, but also the possibility. And as we've heard, history is more about possibilities and probabilities than certainties. The fact is, we do have the kind of historical evidence a resurrection would leave behind, and much more evidence pointing in that direction than we'd expect if it were a mistake, a legend, a fraud. It looks like there probably was an empty tomb, and it looks even more likely that lots of people thought they'd seen Jesus alive from the dead. That is where history leads us. But it's also where it leaves us. How we interpret the evidence depends not on historical considerations, but on background beliefs about God and nature. I mean, if I hold that the laws of nature define the limits of what's possible in the universe, there's no lawgiver, there's no God behind the laws, then in principle, a miracle like the resurrection of Jesus can never be viewed as rational. No amount of evidence could be accepted as evidence that it had taken place. We may notice that there's a resurrection-shaped hole in the historical record and then just leave it there, or try and explain it away somehow. But if I hold that the laws of nature don't define the limits of what's possible, that maybe the laws themselves point to a lawgiver, then given that such a lawgiver could act through and beyond the natural laws, it's rational to believe in a miracle like the resurrection if there's decent evidence for it. I've often thought, what if the center of Christianity wasn't the resurrection, but some other equally weird event with the same quality of evidence, but was a natural event, not a miraculous one? I reckon every historian would accept it. For example, if the claim at the heart of the resurrection was that Jesus was just the strongest man in the Roman Empire, that he survived formal crucifixion, that he limbered up, turned over the great stone, beat up the Roman soldiers, collected his disciples, and then went down to Alexandria or somewhere and lived out his days happily ever after. If we had the same early widespread evidence for this strongman Jesus that we have for the risen Jesus, no historian would doubt it. The problem with the resurrection isn't really a historical one. It's a puzzle, for sure, but it's not really a problem. It's not that we don't have the kinds of evidence a resurrection would leave behind. We do have that kind of evidence. But answering the question definitively, did Jesus rise from the dead? That is above the pay grade of the historian. Or is it? I asked Richard Borkham.
What do you make of the view of many, including biblical historians, that the resurrection of Jesus can't be a proper topic of study in history? Because in order for us all to play the game of history, we must move forward with naturalistic assumptions, and we can't even countenance a supernatural event.
I think that in a way that's ruling out in advance what your historical study might discover about the past. I realise that it's actually a very tricky issue, because when we think about the past, we're all inevitably influenced by what we know human life to be like now. But in a way, historians have to get out of that habit, because so much was different in different societies and different periods of the past. And we have to learn to think that certain things didn't happen the way they happen now. And of course, that isn't a case of natural law, so to speak, but it's a general point about historical inquiry. I think that the special thing about the resurrection, I think, is not so much that it seems to contradict what we all think happens in terms of the natural sciences. It's more that it's an event of immense importance if it happened. I mean, there are lots of historical events. One can just weigh up the evidence. It doesn't really make much difference to one which way you decide, But most people who look at the resurrection know that if it happened, it's immensely important. It's not something they can just say, oh yes, it happened, and then move on with their life and write the next book about something else, It's tremendously important. And that's why I think it's very difficult for people to judge it without, as it were, taking into account the consequences that would follow from thinking that it happened. And that's why I think for some people it is simply impossible. Not, I think, because of the natural science issue in the end, but much more because they can't envisage their whole view of the world and their approach to the world and their living of their own life and so on, everything changing in the radical way that it would have to change if one accepted the resurrection as an event. So I think it's that idea that everybody who thinks about the resurrection has, as it were, a stake in whether it's true that makes it a rather special event. I really think that's more influential than the question of miracle or defiance of natural science.
Let's press pause. I've got a 5-minute Jesus for you. Years ago, I had the great privilege of meeting a man named James. He was a magistrate of the Court of New South Wales. He turned up at my church and sat right up there in the back row after receiving a serious cancer diagnosis. He wasn't a churchy, but after the diagnosis, he thought he should just take a second look. And when I introduced myself to him, because I was the minister there at the church, I went straight up to him afterwards before he could leave quickly. He told me about his cancer diagnosis, and he said, I know you're probably cynical about that. And I said, no, I'm the last person to be cynical about that. But what he said was, this cancer diagnosis has just brought clarity to his mind about what really matters. And he said, 2 things seem to matter most: my family, and if there's a God, getting to know that. At first, he just wanted to talk intellectually. So I went over to his house just around the corner from church, and we had a cup of tea, and we just talked about, philosophy, the Trinity, and all sorts of stuff. But by about the second or third time I went over to his home, he started to compare his legal expertise with historical evidence, which was my great interest, of course. He pointed out that both really boil down to scrutinizing testimony. He reflected on all the massive, life-changing decisions that he'd made for other people in his courtroom based on testimony. I'll never forget the day he said to me that he'd been reading the Gospels, and he'd come to judge that they had the ring of good testimony, especially the crucifixion and resurrection narratives. And he told me he thought Jesus rose again. So now what? He's come to this sort of intellectual decision that Jesus probably rose again. At that point, the conversation, of course, became more than intellectual. And over the next few weeks and more cups of tea, James came to trust that Christ's death and resurrection was a pledge that God can breathe life where there is death. That maybe there was more for him than just this one-way encroaching cancer. I saw him just a few days before he died. He was in hospital, he was in a morphine stupor, and I walked into the room and I said, "James, it's John. Do you want me to pray with you?" And he shot his hand up through the bed sheets and grabbed hold of my hand. And I prayed. It was the kind of prayer ministers are embarrassed to pray. I just sort of mumbled and bumbled and hoped for the best. And by the time I'd finished my prayer, he was back into his morphine sleep. 3 days later, he died. But I'd say more alive than anyone listening to this podcast. At his funeral, which his family asked me to lead, was the Legal Fraternity of Sydney. It was a massive church event, and speaker after speaker gave a eulogy. There were like 5 or 6 eulogies, and so many of the speakers were sort of legal experts, and they kept on talking about the way James was known in the courts for having impeccable judgment. That was the expression they kept on using. And as I sat there listening, and it was eventually my turn to get up and give the sermon, basically, they'd given me the sermon. I got up and I said, "You've talked about his impeccable judgment. Let me tell you the final impeccable judgment that James made. Jesus rose again. The testimony of the Gospels has the ring of good testimony." Now, I'm not sure anyone at that funeral was interested in what I had to say, but I'm pretty sure it's what James wanted me to tell them. Jesus rose again, and that was the guarantee for his eternal life. You can press play now.
And finally, what would be your best tip or two to, say, maybe some listeners who think any explanation is surely better than the spiritual one, through to the person who just doesn't know what to make of it all?
I think one should say that if you're trying to look at the evidence from a historical point of view, you should remember that a good historian is steering a course between skepticism and gullibility. So the good historian doesn't accept things in a way that is gullible, as it were, without thinking seriously about them. But nor does the serious historian dismiss things too easily if there's reasonable evidence. So it's weighing up the evidence without a bias to either skepticism or gullibility, I would say, is important. To the person who says, "I can't accept that, any explanation would be better than that resurrection happened," I would just ask them to think about why they think that. Why would any explanation, even the most improbable, seem more probable than that God raised Jesus from the dead? And to examine their own presuppositions and their own attitude to life and what difference they think it would make to them if they changed their mind, I think to be a bit critical about one's own presuppositions and one's own, as it were, predispositions to believe this or that about the world.
Richard Borkham, thank you so much. If you want to find more about anything you've heard in today's episode, Researcher Al has got some great show notes for you. All the links to the books and shows and people that we mention, and some deep dives into the more complicated stuff as well. It's a nerd's heaven, which is why we give it to Researcher Al. Head to undeceptions.com to find all the details. They're way too long to put in the notes you find in your little podcast app, by the way, so do go to the website. If you have questions about this episode or any of the other ones, you can send me a question. You'll see the options in the show notes. You can send us an audio or text message, and I'll try and answer it in this season's Q&A episode. And why not become an Undeceptions Plus subscriber, where, for example, you'll get the full uncut interview with guests like Richard Borkham. You'll get first access to our live events and heaps more. Head to undeceptions.com/plus. Next episode, I head over to Oxford to chat to the great English theologian N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, about why a true understanding of Jesus' teaching about the kingdom of God can protect us against both the political passivity that some people fall into and the Christian nationalism that is gaining traction. This is a hot one. See ya. Undeceptions is hosted by me, John Dixon, produced by Kaylee Payne, and directed by Mark Elvis is Alive Hadley. Sophie Hawkshaw is on socials and membership. Alistair Belling is a writer and researcher. Siobhan McGuinness is our online librarian. Lindy Leviston remains my wonderful assistant. Santino DeMarco is Chief Finance and Operations Consultant. Editing by Richard Humwee. Our voice actors today were, of course, Dakota Love and Yannick Laurie. Special thanks to our series sponsor Zondervan for making this Undeception possible. Undeceptions is the flagship podcast of undeceptions.com, letting the truth out. An Undeceptions podcast.